Yeah, so we've got a few people joining. I'll stick to time and get started promptly. So hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. Welcome to the MBA Fundamentals live Q&A with Andrew Stephen and Attie Lotz. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started proper. Just to say this session is being recorded. You'll notice there's a red dot in the middle of the screen there. That's for the benefit of those who couldn't join today, but still want to see the recording. So just to say we are recording this. And we are keen to hear from you and hear your questions throughout this session. So please use the Q&A box for those questions as opposed to the chat box, because that just helps us keep it all in an orderly fashion. So I'll just hand over to Attie now for a round of intros.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Alex. And hello, everybody. I'm Attie Lotz, and I'm one of the tutors for the MBA Fundamentals program. Professionally, other than being a tutor, I'm an innovation and strategy designer. Essentially, what I do is I help organizations solve problems by deeply understanding people. And whether that's employees or customers, it's all about human-centered design for me and finding creative solutions to real-world challenges. And it's my pleasure to have you all here, and an even greater privilege to have Professor Andrew Stephen join us. He is the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at Oxford Said and Deputy Dean for Faculty and Research. Many of you will get to know Professor Stephen from the course content, and he is one of the world's foremost voices in marketing research, particularly in the areas of digital strategy, AI in marketing, and consumer behavior. With that, welcome, Professor.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me today.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Maybe before we dive into, so today's session is structured around the key themes and excellent questions that you as the participants submitted ahead of time. So thank you for that. But before we dive into that, Professor, maybe you can share a bit about the Oxford Future Marketing Initiative.
Sure. Yeah, so the Oxford Future of Marketing Initiative is one of our research centers at Oxford Said that myself and a few other colleagues created actually about 10 years ago. We're coming up to celebrating its 10th birthday. But it's a research center at the school that's probably quite unique because its whole mission is to work in collaboration with practice, so in collaboration with marketing professionals and technology companies and advertising agencies and big brands to really help identify what are the big issues in marketing practice that marketing professionals need to be understanding better, and where academic research, sort of rigorous scientific research, can really help shed some light on some of these difficult issues. So as you can imagine, we do a lot of work related to new technologies, particularly AI coming into marketing and advertising and media and communications. For instance, helping understand, well, what works and doesn't work when you're marketing products or services through digital channels that are very AI enabled and in markets that are very AI mediated now. What's happening with consumer behavior in the AI space, shifting maybe, away from sort of the classic ways that consumers would search for new products or services to using things like ChatGPT or Gemini to help them search and even make decisions around what to buy or what not to buy, and what to use, what not to use. And so there's lots of really interesting things going on. And yeah, the Future of Marketing Initiative is really designed to not just sort of be a think tank, but rather a place where we conduct really, novel and strong and important academic research, but really with the intended target being to help businesses do better with marketing in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think that leads us nicely into the first topic, right? And I don't think there's any better place than to start with AI, if that's okay. So
Absolutely.
everyone is talking about AI for productivity and efficiency gains. But you look at this through a deeply strategic lens, and beyond
Yep.
just doing things faster, what do you see as the most truly transformative uses of AI in marketing over the next few years? And then the follow-up would be, and what hidden pitfalls should leadership be worrying about right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, There's lots, and I think, whether, I mean, I'm a marketing professor, so I can talk about this in the context of, say, marketing and product development and innovation type things. Um, but every business discipline is obviously um, looking at how their work and their processes and their sort of strategic and tactical approaches to all sorts of things are being shaped by AI and what's possible with these new tools. And so, Attie, you mentioned thinking about efficiency and productivity. I think that's the jumping off point for everybody and has been certainly for the last few years in all kinds of organizations and in all the different functions and departments and disciplines. And that's very true for marketing. How can we improve the personal productivity if we give, I don't know, if we give everyone in the organization a license to ChatGPT or to Claude or to Copilot or whatever it might be, what are they using in their sort of personal professional work to speed things up, to do a better job, those sorts of things. So I think that's fine, and that's sort of certainly in what we see with lots of types of organizations, public and private sector, by the way, around the world. It's this sort of, okay, let's start with thinking about efficiency, cost and time efficiencies. But then I think what senior executives, and this is very true in marketing, I'll give you some examples, are increasingly shifting towards is saying, okay, that's fine, but what else can we do? What can we do more on the, let's say, the effectiveness side of the coin? We can be more efficient, can be faster, can save costs. We can free up resources basically to divert to other things. Then it sort of begs the question, well, what are those other things that we want to be doing? And so I think that's the, sort of the strategic executive consideration. Is thinking about that. But I think where I'm seeing a lot of, I think, really, really effective work in, say, the marketing world is actually where companies are approaching efficiency and effectiveness together and looking for not just, okay, can we do things faster, but can we do things faster and better that will be increasing customer value and therefore hopefully business value as well. So an example, say in new product innovation or new product development. So this is a common problem in lots of companies, certainly in sort of consumer goods, sort of product categories. There's this, particularly in sort of fairly mature categories, there's a constant competitive pressure to innovate with either new products or adaptations or improvements upon existing products or both, essentially to stay top of mind and salient to consumers. So, whether that's in exciting product categories or boring product categories, there's always this constant, okay, we need to refresh things. Every year we need to bring out a new version of the product in, whatever that might be. And so there's this whole innovation process that goes into that. And many of you will be familiar with this in your own experience, where you're sort of starting with insights from the market. So what are competitors doing? What are the trends out there in the product category? What are consumers saying they want? So there's a lot of information that goes into that. Typically, market research, consumer insights, competitor analysis, market intelligence, lots of data, lots of reports, lots of surveys, focus groups, you name it. That whole kind of insights engine is something that, companies are very, very familiar with. That takes a lot of time and that's costly. And so one thing that, particularly large sort of multinational consumer goods or fast-moving consumer goods companies have been doing in recent years is saying, well, how could we use generative AI to help us to come up with actionable insights that can inform new product development or product improvements faster? Because there's just a lot of information that is out there, and it takes a lot of time for humans manually to go through that, but a lot of human expertise as well. And so one is, okay, how can we come up with insights faster? Because remember, in mature markets, it's highly competitive. So, to get to market quicker with some new amazing innovation in a product, let's say, and to beat your competitors at that is really, really important. So speed is competitively valuable. So, one example, we've been actually working a case study with Reckitt. Reckitt's a big multinational consumer goods company, makes brands like Dettol, Harpic, Lysol, Nurofen, Durex. So personal care, personal hygiene, household care, household cleaning sort of product categories. And working with their chief insights and analytics officer, we've really seen sort of an interesting transformation where they sort of brought into their consumer insights teams access to custom large language models, so custom versions of ChatGPT type sorts of things that are sort of trained on the big foundation models, but then use a lot of their own proprietary data on their markets, on their customers, on their brands, on their sales, on their retailer partnerships all around the world. And that's really helped them do insights faster, but also better. Because if, in some sense, if you think about what makes for a really good or a better consumer insight to inform new product development, well, ultimately, those insights need to lead to product development concepts that actually do better in the market. And so over the last couple of years, what they've been doing is they've found that they can reduce the amount of time it takes end to end to go from sort of insight to testable market concept or product concept, reduce that by about 60%. So there's your efficiency gain. But then also actually compared to just the human only process, get twice as many what they would call kind of green lit or green light product concepts to actually go to market that are then going to be successful than what they would have had with humans alone. So the humans alone part is important because that's where the expertise and the deep knowledge of the market and the product category and all of those sorts of things comes into play. But what they found is augmenting that, not replacing it, but augmenting it with AI can speed things up, which is competitively important, but then also result in more better ideas that they can take to market. So ultimately creating more value for customers and therefore more value for their brands. So I think that's a really good example of AI being put into a process not to replace humans, but to augment and help humans that results in efficiency and effectiveness gains, not just productivity, which is great, but I think strategically not enough in competitive environments.
Yeah, I've personally in my work seen, augmenting myself with, so I'm a design thinking practitioner and doing, focusing on ethnographic style interviews or understanding the customer quite well, and then feeding that qualitative data into an AI model to kind of build a persona that you can interact with. That's been quite fun and quite interesting to get back. There's the problem of hallucination because it doesn't like gaps in the knowledge. There's always that.
Yeah.
And then maybe that brings us to the next question around ethical guardrails of these
Mm-hmm.
tools that we use, right? So it's one thing for a company to acquire these advanced analytical tools, but it's another to use them responsibly. And maybe you can share your thoughts on how should modern marketing leaders navigate the fine line between deeply personalized consumer experiences and what some people have called surveillance style marketing. Where's
Yeah.
the ethical guardrails?
Well, and this is certainly the case in digital marketing practice for, at least 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. If you think about, ad targeting on social platforms, for example, and the amounts of data that are being used. So I think actually in marketing, and particularly in sort of the communications and advertising side of marketing, the sort of responsible practices, ethical guidelines, in the AI age, if we want to call it that, are not that different because it's sort of a continuation of a trend that we've seen now for a very long time where there's, more and more and more and more and more amounts of personal data on customers that you can access and that you can leverage for personalized targeting of ads, for instance, or those sorts of things. And so thinking about what's appropriate to do with those sorts of data is sort of the perennially important sort of guiding principle, if you will. that marketers need to adhere to. I think it gets trickier in sort of the AI context, because then we're thinking about even more complex sort of data sources on customers. And so what's interesting there is, if we take actually pre-AI, take just as an example, social media, like the information that a social media platform has of a user, whether we're talking Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, that's a lot. And it's all based on signals that are, and that the advertisers can then target ads based on signals that are sort of inferred based on users' interactions on those platforms. So at a very rudimentary level, the things that I post about, the topics that I post about, or the topics that I like, or the sorts of people or brands or influencers or creators that I follow, this is all information that the platform can use to infer, okay, this is the sort of stuff you're interested in as a user, and then match that to, the sorts of people an advertiser is looking to target ads and content at. So that's the sort of feed algorithm, how that's always worked. And of course, that's now AI enabled, even more so. And so the idea there is that you get even better or more precise matching to sort of more narrow or niche kind of characteristics. Put that into the context, though, of sort of consumer grade large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini and so on. They know much more about an individual user than a social media platform would know. Because in a social media environment, it knows the sort of the public facing content that you're looking at, the things that you're interested in, but not really private stuff. Or most people aren't going to, post about their deepest, most private thoughts. But we know from research on usage of chat-based AI tools and platforms, people do share their deepest inner thoughts. And so what is happening over time is the knowledge that, let's just say ChatGPT, just for the sake of picking one, it's knowledge about every user because of memory, and also because the models are getting better, and memory capability of those models also is expanding. It knows a lot about you that Meta doesn't know, Google doesn't know, and other sort of digital media platforms don't know. So that becomes an interesting ethical dilemma once we get into the world of thinking about agentic commerce or agent-based shopping. And also, actually, if you put ads into these platforms, and OpenAI has publicly said they're exploring advertising within ChatGPT, and we'll see how that works. And we know there's already been a lot of concern about that, which resulted in partly sort of shift from OpenAI to Anthropic for a lot of people 6 or so months ago. But understanding deeper, what makes you tick, or at least what a large language model is inferring about what makes you tick, is more than just, here are the videos that I watch on YouTube, and what does that say about me as a consumer. So that becomes, I think, something that brands have to contend with ethically, because if they want to think about things like generative engine optimization, they want to think about sort of commerce or shopping agents and AI mediated marketplaces where consumer or customer has their agent for whatever product category, and brand has its agents to interact with those agents, which is happening, but will increasingly happen, I think, in the next year or so. There's an ethical layer on that, which is, okay, if I'm a brand and want to be essentially targeting people through AI, realizing what the AI knows about those people might be really stepping into ethically gray territory, and the brand then needs to decide, is that the sort of thing that we want to be doing or not? Because it's a lot larger space of information that an AI platform could have about its users than any other kind of media platform has had in the history of media, digital media. So I think it's an ethical dilemma for companies to think about: do we enter into that sort of type of commerce and that type of sort of AI mediated interactions with customers. It's obviously not within their control because it's the AI platforms that are, sort of deciding what's fair game or not, but very, very similar to what's happened in the past with the social media and other digital media platforms deciding what's fair game or not, what can you target on versus not. So I think we're going to see history repeat itself in terms of lots of ethical questions and dilemmas where the tech platforms are the ones in control, but the brands have to decide how and if and when they wish to engage.
Fascinating. Yeah, I've recently, for the sake of playing with it, I gave Google access to my soul and switched on personalized intelligence. And then asking it questions like, what do you think my values are? It's scary what it knows, what it can infer. I say scary, it's interesting as well. I mean, I'm doing it for the sake of testing it myself.
Well,
Anyway,
I mean, on that point, we're working on some current research projects actually looking at this in the context of consumer behavior. Because and I encourage anybody, on the webinar or watching this video later on, go into whether it's Google or whether it's Gemini or anything else. Go in and ask, what are my values as a consumer? Even I mean that's a very simple prompt. You might want to get much more detailed than that and break it down in terms of product category or type of consumption occasion. You could go to town with prompt specificity there, but even just a very high level, what are my values as a consumer? That can be quite interesting. And then you say, okay, well, apply those values to this purchase decision that I need to make on, whatever it might be. And then it will come up with recommendations. But what's really interesting there is, and this is probably what you experience as well, Attie, is it surfaces values, personal values that you might just not have thought about. That at first glance, you're like, huh, that's not really me. But then if you sort of reflect on it a bit, you're like, okay, I can see that. And then you could probe it. Well, where is that coming from? What have I told you in the past that's made you think that I really care about whatever? But imagine, for the typical consumer, they're not going to try and almost, coach their AI of choice into really knowing, like, so you could say, okay, give me the 10 most important values I have as a consumer when I'm, I don't know, buying a car, let's say. And you could say, okay, well, I agree with number one, I disagree with number two, here's why. Like you could go through and coach it and refine it. I don't think most people would go to that much effort. But then think about what that happens if not far from now, the next step is to not just say, what are my values as a consumer? Help me come up with some, options for buying a new car, or I'm buying a new TV, or I'm buying laundry detergent, whatever it might be. But rather just go and do that for me, please. You're an agent. I've set you up. You've got access to my Amazon account or whatever. Go ahead and do that. What the model is going to be doing is try to maximize the expected utility that its consumer is going to get by choosing the alternative, the brand or the product that it thinks best fits those values. And that can lead to some different types of choices than what you might have originally made on, in sort of as a purely sort of cognitive human consumer. And so that has massive implications for brands, because what it really says is actually they need deeper insights into their consumers, because the sorts of things like in a given product category, you go, okay, we know in this category consumers care mostly about this, and this. Well, maybe they do on average in general, but maybe not, at a very, very, very idiosyncratic personal level. Maybe the values that I would use or that my AI agent would use to screen in or out alternatives could be very, very different to yours. But importantly, they might actually have product characteristics or features that wouldn't normally be considered in that category by a brand, thinking about it in a sort of a more kind of sort of averaging or general kind of way. So it makes things much more personalized. but also therefore much more uncertain for brands because it means they need to know even more. To master that, they need to know even more from an insight standpoint about their consumers, and sort of it starts to make me think. I mean, think about classic marketing things like segmentation and targeting. We've been talking about personalized targeting and those smaller segments for many years, but this takes that even further to the extreme, where segmentation and targeting is what you have to do. But how do you think about segmentation and targeting in such a hyper personalized and values based or values driven way is very new territory.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, whether you do view it as there's fundamentally a shift away from managing demographic segments to managing more fluid, real-time human behavior. And it would seem that that is.
Well, and yeah, I mean, and I think what we're seeing is, and we shouldn't throw out the sort of the classic principles, because those classic principles are always helpful as a starting point. But I don't think, even if we go back, even if we go back pre-internet in marketing, like think about like very, very, very classic sort of marketing strategy. You segment the market, you identify which segments to target. Those segments have, demographic sort of stereotypes, if you will. That's a good starting point. I think where AI comes into it is all the things that we're just talking about, where you can get much more detailed and personalized or hyper personalized. Factors beyond just sort of demographic and socioeconomic status and psychographic things can come into play, sort of more deeper values and so on. That's all great, but AI can also help refine the segmentation and targeting. So it can be sort of a strategic partner, if you will. So I think classic frameworks, and again, this is I think true in not just in marketing. We need somewhere to start, but then we need to think about, okay, but how can AI then enable us as leaders, as executives, as professionals to go further and better, building on top of sort of the basic frameworks and foundational principles. So I don't think, I don't think the fundamentals need to change, but I think we need to think about then how do you build on top of those fundamentals in clever ways, and see AI as an enabler of doing better things, as opposed to saying we need to completely change the nature of the game, or we completely, it's not about throwing out what we know. It's rather about augmenting and building on top of what we know. Because humans are still humans. For the moment, we're still marketing to humans. And so human psychology therefore matters, and that doesn't change as much. The way our brains process information and the way we're sort of, physically wired in that sense, is pretty stable. It's just we're layering in other things on top that augment our humanity, if you want to sort of think about it that way. So we need to think about those implications, but it means unless we completely dehumanize, then with complete automation with agents, for instance, would be an example of that. But outside of that sort of area of use case, the human psychology is still there, which means that the fundamental frameworks are still relevant because they're built on decades and decades and decades of knowledge on essentially human psychology in markets.
Yeah, I think that's where this MBA Fundamentals program is relevant, where we do cover the fundamentals and we lay down the groundwork for that. But maybe we can quickly talk about some of the people watching today. They're in this AI dominant environment that we're moving into or have found ourselves in at the moment. What would you say are the 2 to 3 non-negotiable skills professionals need to hone to remain relevant?
Well, where do we start? So I think maybe I'll start with actually some sort of maybe some of these are going to be skills and some of them are going to be sort of more like values, actually. So I think maybe a value to start with is sort of adaptability and curiosity. So one of the things that we know whenever new technologies come along into business, there's always this sort of resistance. And it's not that people want to block things necessarily, but there's uncertainty. If I use this new technology instead of whatever I was doing previously, it carries some risk. But also we need to be able to be flexible, adaptive, curious, sort of have a bit more of an innovation mindset, experiment with things, um, in order to actually see what works and what doesn't work, in your particular industry, in your context, with your customers, in your market, etc. So I think as a sort of a personal value that anybody, whatever level or stage of your career you are, having a bit more of that open-mindedness and being willing to try and test and learn through experimentation is really, really vital. For a leader, again, whether you're just leading a team or you're a senior executive or kind of anything in between, making sure, therefore, that you find a way to have a psychologically safe culture for that type of experimentation is important. So, many of us have a lot of experience in organizations and disciplines and industries that are very risk averse. They have a very low tolerance for risk. And certainly if you're in a regulated industry, that's even more the case. So that becomes a bit of a tension, like figuring out, okay, how do I create in my team and my own professional practice a little bit more of a risk tolerance whilst still operating within sort of inherently risk averse industry or environment or organizational culture. So that's what certainly talking to lots of leaders on AI programs that come through Oxford Said, that's one of the biggest ones, is how do I kind of be open and try new things and encourage my team to do that while still kind of keeping some control on the risk of things and managing uncertainty. In terms of other skills, so I mean that sort of reflects values and sort of a whole set of leadership skills. I think other things are, I mean, people talk about being good with prompting and those sorts of things, and I think they're important skills and capabilities. But I think that's something that you can train. That's something that develops over time. That's something that you can sort of teach people about practical skills with AI. I think another sort of skill, and again, this is maybe a reflection of a bit more of a strategic mindset shift, is back to what we were talking about earlier about efficiency versus effectiveness, and actually trying to be a bit more strategic minded in thinking not just about resource costs, so time and money, but thinking about, okay, how can I create value, not just through saving resources, but how can I create new sources of value with whatever it is I'm doing with AI. And again, at a personal, level in my job, how can I use this to, I don't know, create a better customer experience so customers are more satisfied, they get more value, they're more loyal, that creates more value for the business. So in sort of at an individual level, you can think about what's my role in this, but then at a strategic level, if you're a more senior level, then thinking about that as, okay, well, our actual business model, how can we think about new sources of value that can be enabled by AI, which is, a different capability that requires a level of understanding of AI that isn't just sort of at a surface level, but rather what's possible, what's not possible, versus just kind of normal, I guess, business model refreshing or new strategies every so often. But a bit of AI knowledge is therefore necessary, because otherwise what happens is you get caught up in the hype. You think about things that would be great, but actually aren't that possible. Which then brings me to the final one, probably I'll give you, is skills and capabilities in really being able to assess an organization's readiness for these things, which requires a more holistic perspective, not just technical readiness, like do we have the right IT systems and data and infrastructure, but rather, okay, thinking about the people issues, the culture issues, stakeholder management, compliance, governance, all those sorts of considerations, and thinking about, okay, are we ready for this, or what work needs to go into various things to get us ready for this, because the last thing you want to do is introduce new AI systems or use cases into an organization that isn't quite ready for it, because then it's just, all of the good things that you hoped would happen in terms of value creation and efficiency are going to be slowed down or are sort of under realized. So readiness before jumping in becomes really important, and sort of a value behind that is to resist the urge of getting attracted by the shiny new toys, but rather taking a careful step back, thinking about how this fits into business processes, thinking about readiness, thinking about culture, thinking about psychological safety, and so on, before then taking that leap, which is maybe hard because there's pressure to move fast, but there's no point moving fast and going in the wrong direction, versus if you just sort of stood back, even just for an extra few weeks or a month, to kind of really assess the situation in the organization before making a much more sort of wise and reasoned decision. So that's a senior leadership challenge, but I think that filters all the way through the organization, because everybody should be asking those sorts of questions. Are we ready for this? Could we digest it? Are there going to be unintended consequences that we can anticipate upfront and then mitigate? These are the sorts of things to think about.
Yeah, but one of the questions I like to ask participants of the program, one of the tutorials, is what are their different company policies towards AI? And a recurring theme that comes up is that there are quite a bunch of companies that are opening up their policy in terms of they're going to give enterprise licenses to employees and let them figure out what the use cases are. Maybe you got some thoughts around that.
Oh yeah, we see this again and again and again. And the funny thing is, I call it the let 1,000 flowers bloom approach. Let's give everybody it's almost like saying, let's give everybody a hammer and let's go see what they can do with it. The problem is you're going to get some broken windows. And so I think there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, we're going to give access widely to these tools, but doing it without a strategy, or without any kind of guardrails in place, or without any sort of from on high sort of top down logic to, like, this is where we see AI fitting into our business, now go and play, is problematic. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of let people experiment, and then the use cases will sort of surface a more grassroots approach, but it sort of needs to be top down and bottom up. You can't just sort of flick the switch, everybody's got a license to Anthropic, and off you go, sort of thing. And what we've actually seen is companies that have done that. Actually, just 2 weeks ago, on a very senior leadership AI program that we had in Oxford, somebody from a big organization, a big bank. I won't. It doesn't matter who they are, but we're basically saying, yeah, look, that's what we did a year ago, and then it was sort of chaotic, Wild West, and so we've now pulled back from that and said, no, here are like the 5 different kind of big types of uses that we expect to see strategically creating value for the business. So we only want to endorse and see use cases that fall within those categories. So they sort of started with a very grassroots, kind of democratized bottom-up approach, realized that in some sense overwhelmed the organization, and it needed a strategy. And so then they layered in that sort of strategic guidance, and created a shared understanding, really, around where AI fits in. And now they're finding that they're getting a lot better value out of it. So it's sort of, it's how it goes, but it's very, very common to see this. Let's just give everybody the tools and let them play, and hope for the best. I think, in lots of organizations that could work pretty well, but there's probably a better way to do it, which is with more strategic guidance as well as giving people access.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Just back to if you don't mind me jumping back to the topic of skills that people can require moving forward. I think another interesting way to look at the same question is, maybe we can view it as what upskilling for an AI-driven world is very much focused on. Well, we have been focusing on what there is to learn. But maybe
Mhm.
a question to also ask is, what do marketers and leaders need to unlearn in this new world that we move into?
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, the big one everybody now talks about is you don't need to worry about coding and data science. Um, I disagree with that, particularly on the data science front. I mean, and if we think about marketing specifically, marketers traditionally haven't really had great skills with things like coding and data science. There's dedicated teams for that. And certainly in lots of types of organizations, there's a lot of data within marketing, whether that's, customer data in, say, CRM systems, or it's product, whatever. It's quite a data-driven discipline and has been for a long time. Um, so you do need analytics capabilities. Should we put every data set that a company has that's marketing or customer related into the hands of everyone in that function, so they can, pop it into an AI system and generate whatever insights they're looking for? Um, maybe not. I think um, I'd feel comfortable if, suppose I was a chief marketing officer in a company, and I wanted my marketing teams, my brand teams, my sales teams, my, customer care teams, whoever. I wanted them to all have, analytics capabilities at their fingertips, to help them do their jobs better and to let them ask the questions. I think that's a pretty good thing. But I'd also want people to understand that, data has limitations. Anything that a data scientist or somebody with an analytics background would know. I mean, data quality is really, really important. Garbage in, garbage out. All of these sorts of principles are, sort of taken for granted by statisticians or data scientists, and they spend a lot of time making sure that they have the right data for the task to answer the questions that they're trying to answer analytically, that the data sets are clean, that they're organized, that they're structured. Like there's a lot of work that goes before you run any kind of statistical analysis, let's say. There's a lot of data work that goes in. So if I was wanting to give those sort of statistical capabilities, if you will, to people without that type of background, I'd want to make sure that there's really, really good data that's already been created. So somebody needs to be doing that. Somebody needs to understand that. So I think when we talk about, analytics capabilities, we don't need to worry about anymore, because we can just, pop up, even just pop an Excel file into ChatGPT and ask it a bunch of questions. I think that's risky. So yes, being able to code data science models maybe is not something that's as important anymore, because we can do that quickly and easily with coding AI. But knowing which models to use, if the data is good or not, and that statistics can lie. All of those sorts of things are important. So it's maybe not replacing or not removing certain capabilities entirely, but tweaking them a bit, or sort of downweighting certain skills within those capabilities and upweighting other skills within those capabilities. So what you really want is your people to still understand what could go wrong, and what the sort of the caveats need to be. They don't necessarily need to do the hands-on work, maybe, but they still need to understand, how you get from an input to an output, and how you would know if that can be trusted. And so, this sort of black or white, we don't need this anymore, you do need that anymore, these jobs are going away, those jobs, I think there's a gray area in there where you need to break it down and say, well, what are the skills that we need to focus more on and less on? But those capabilities might not fully go away.
Interesting. Maybe we can take just a short break from the interesting AI specific
Yep.
discussion, because we've got a question here from one of the participants, live question.
Hmm.
And the question is, what should one do when a particular marketing strategy that seems to be fitting prior to deployment, like geo-targeting, does not work as it should have been?
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. I think the normal thing you would do is try and diagnose, okay, why isn't that working? And what's within your control. So it might be outside of your control. It just might be that there's a new competitive threat, for instance. And so you need to understand that better and then figure out what your response is. It might be that something else has changed in that market, they say that geographic market, for instance, or whatever else. So I think the first step when a strategy that's been working starts to not work as well anymore is to go back and figure out, okay, well, what's changed that might help explain the change in the performance. And then once you've kind of figured that out, think about, okay, if it becomes really obvious and apparent, oh, okay, that's what's changed. Okay, then you need to think about how you're going to change your strategy in response to that. More typically, you're not going to know for sure, is it, well, okay, was it this change or that change? There could be maybe 2 or 3 plausible explanations for why performance has gone down. And so then the approach is going to be, well, we need to sort of think about what our responses would be under those different sort of explanations, those different scenarios, and then do some testing to see what actually moves the needle or not. So really, I think it starts with diagnosis, then it's sort of strategic response, testing your response, and then update the strategy. But what you don't want to do is a complete knee-jerk reaction and go, well, okay, that's not working now, so we need to change everything. Because chances are most of what you've been doing still works. It's just that something else has, changed in there that's undermining the performance. And once you kind of get down to the detail, then that will help you adapt in sort of a less dramatic way.
Fantastic. No, thank you. And thank you to Hashira for the question. For everybody else who wants to post a question, if you don't see the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom, maybe try the 3 dots, the more, and under there's Q&A, and you should be able to post your questions. We'll also be handing over to Alex shortly, and then he can cover any administrative questions that you may have about the specific program. But Professor, I've got one last question around the bigger picture that we're operating, have been discussing. Right, with all this data and technology at our disposal, human behavior surely is changing in unexpected ways. And maybe you can share in your recent research if there are any consumer shifts that have surprised you the most. Maybe ones that traditional marketing models are failing to account for.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a ton about AI, so maybe I want to mention a few other things that are shifting consumers, just so that we balance it out, and it's not just all about tech and AI. And there other big issues in the world, right? So it's not just about technology. There's all sorts of other social issues, geopolitical issues, and so on. So I think one of the things that we've been working on for, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, is looking at consumer shifts in social responsibility of brands, and particularly as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how brands do or don't kind of show up in more progressive ways in the marketplace. Because there's over certainly the last sort of 5, well, maybe almost going on a decade, 10 years, there's been increasing pressure in not everywhere in the world, but in certain parts of the world, where consumers are sort of expecting more of brands, expecting more than just a high quality product at a reasonable price or good service or whatever, but expecting them to almost make sort of progressive social statements. And sometimes brands get that right, sometimes brands overshoot, they get it wrong, there's backlash, and so some brands don't want to go there because they feel like it's too dangerous and risky. different, different political persuasions in governments around the world will also have views on this, and so it's murky territory and risky territory. But what we've been doing research on for the last few years, as I said, is really trying to understand, is a brand being more progressive in its advertising from a diversity standpoint, from an inclusion standpoint? Does it actually help the business? So setting aside, sort of judgments on whether that's morally, an imperative or not, people will have different views on that, but rather just saying from a purely commercial standpoint, is it a good thing? Because if it is, then it reflects that that's actually what consumers want, because they're voting with their wallets, essentially. So we did a really big study that came out about a year and a half ago in partnership with the United Nations. So the United Nations has an agency within the UN called the Unstereotype Alliance, which is sort of an industry collective within marketing and advertising that has a goal to get harmful stereotypes out of marketing and advertising. So because the UN's belief is that is harmful for the world, which I would agree with. But what we did with them is they said, look, we're preaching to the choir. The people who listen to us all believe that, more progressive, more inclusive, more diverse advertising is the right thing to do. But not every corporate boardroom thinks that. Not every chief financial officer or CEO or board director necessarily believes that, and particularly if they're faced with political pressure against it. So we did a study. It was about just under 400 brands, I think 392 brands, global study, about 60 countries, 4 years worth of data, branding, brand performance, brand equity, and sales data for all of these brands, as well as their advertising scores around how inclusive and progressive their ads were, because there's metrics that the industry uses as standard to measure this stuff. What we found in a nutshell was it helps business. It's not just a good thing. It's actually a win-win or a win-win-win situation for the brands, for society, and for their customers. Where more diverse and progressive advertising actually does increase sales, gives you a sales uplift. It increases your brand equity over time. It is good for business. So whether you have a moral perspective on it or not, if you're purely commercial, you would say, okay, we need to do that because that's going to be good for the business. And so we've been looking at that set of issues because it's very otherwise contentious, and we wanted to put some evidence into it. We're now about to do version 2 of that study later this year, so updating it. And then we're actually doing the same thing for environmental sustainability. We're just putting together a consortium of brands and advertisers who will contribute data, and we'll look at the same thing. Is more environmentally responsible and sustainable approaches to marketing. Does that actually pay off? Not just being good for the planet, but good for business. So these are the other sorts of issues that we're looking at, not just AI, but this sort of perspective of business should have a positive impact on society, but you shouldn't do that at the cost of business. So how do you get to, and Attie, as you know very, very well, this is the final module of the program, where we try and say, well, how can we have a positive impact on the world as well and the communities businesses serve, but also doing it so it's healthy for the business. So that sort of win-win type situation.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Definitely one of my favorite modules from the program is that. Professor, thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for today to ask questions. I think let's leave some time left for the more technical side of questions about the program for Alex. Alex, maybe, yeah, so with that, Professor, thank you very much. Always fascinating chatting with you.
My pleasure, thank you.
And then Alex, maybe just to kick things off from a more administrative point of view, maybe you can share around about just a bit about the essential logistics, covering some details regarding cost, payment flexibility, what entry qualifications there are, etc.
Sure, thanks, Attie. So it's just to say the MBA Fundamentals program is a 10-week fully online course. Our requirements are we ask you to pay the £3,500 upfront as part of joining. There are actual discounts that we run, and I'll come on to that in a moment. We're running a 20% discount currently, and I'll share that shortly. But essentially, it's 7 to 10 hours per week of self-directed learning. There's usually at least one live call per week with little assessments towards the end of each week. In terms of those assessments, you're looking at something like 9 graded quizzes. They make up 10% of your final grade. You'll have 3 longer assignments, usually of around 1,000 to 1,500 words each, and they make up 80% of your final grade. And then there are 9 graded discussion groups as well, and those are sort of graded discussion forums where you'll get together with the rest of your cohort and engage on a topic that is posted and grade you on your ability to apply the theory to your answers through that. In terms of payment plans, if you're unable to pay up front and in full, we do offer a couple of different options. So you can do the Flywire approach, which allows you to split the payment. So you can have one payment on one card and then repeat with a second card to split the payment. There are also installment options via PayPal and Apple Pay, as they offer certain installation options to eligible customers. So more of that on our website. Was there anything else, Attie, you wanted me to cover in terms of logistics?
Did we cover entry qualifications that people may need?
No entry qualifications outside of paying the course fee that through the course website. So once you've paid that, you're through.
Fantastic. Yeah, maybe we could even open the floor a bit if there's any more questions that we can pose to Alex. Maybe Alex, you can share a bit about the alumni network and the access that participants of the program get and the benefits regarding that.
So the first thing to say is that the networking on this course is very strong because we get a lot of people from different backgrounds, different levels of experience, because it covers sort of all areas of business. So you get a lot of people who are 5, 10, 15 years into their career and they're looking to upskill or pivot in a new direction. We have a bit of a philosophy of what got you here won't get you there. So there's a little bit of upskilling and filling potential gaps in your knowledge. So there's a lot of opportunity to connect with people on the course. But then when you're through the course, once you've passed, you then have the option of opting into our alumni community, which is a much bigger network. It's essentially the Oxford Club, some 70,000 different countries, 130,000 different members so far. Across these different countries, different backgrounds, different disciplines. So it's a big sort of networking hub, but there's also a lot of opportunities for thought leadership, for events that we run, for sharing content. So it's everything you'd expect essentially from an Oxford alumni community.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, we've got a question on the chat, on the Q&A. Will you have similar sessions on the EMBA? I do not know the answer to this question.
So the executive MBA. So the first thing to say is this is not the full MBA. This is the MBA Fundamentals program, and likewise the executive MBA program is again a different one again. So these aren't those courses. These are bite-sized online. This is not a bite-sized online course that we're talking about. So what I'd say is that this pulls from the main MBA, and we have a lot of the faculty and content from the main MBA in this 10-week online course. So what it does give you is an insight into what the main MBA looks and feels like. Should you then wish to go on to do the full MBA or potentially even EMBA. But this is not those courses. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, and another question that we got from participants before the call and that we often get from people on these webinars is where potential participants want to know about the course structure, the learning experience, and the outcomes. And I'm happy to field this question if you want. Yeah, the course structure, there's 9 modules. It's broken down into blocks of content. So there's 3 blocks, each with 3 modules in them, where block 1 typically covers understanding business, so strategy, marketing, entrepreneurship, innovation. Block 2 covers more about the information and skills and frameworks that will enable you to run an efficient organization. So covering things like operations management, financial valuations, And then in block 3, we cover what it takes to lead an organization. So leadership, organizational design, and then impact within that Professor Stephen briefly covered for us, and looking at win-win-win for society, the business, the brand itself, and for customers, which is a great module and a great way to end the course. What the learning experience is like is, so as interaction goes with us, the tutors, and faculty, is there are faculty live sessions within the course where we have these type of Q&A where you get to actually interact directly with Oxford professors like Professor Andrew Stephen, where we have a live session, and it's not just typing your questions. You can unmute and have a chat with him and discuss, ask him pertinent questions. Then there are also tutorials, which is with tutors like myself. Usually I work with another tutor where our skill set overlaps slightly, but we have different skill sets, so we cover a more broader set of knowledge and professional expertise that we can bring to the course and to your learning experience, because in the end we're learning facilitators, and that's how we view our work here. And then as far as assignments go, or learning outcomes of what you should present, there are 3 core assessments that you do. There are quizzes in between modules that you do. Those are quick and easy and just reinforce your learning. And then there are assessments, which is long form assessments that you submit. They're designed quite well, so you can't just do it with AI, but really give you a chance to practically apply what you've learned, especially the frameworks that we cover. And then you get excellent, if I may say so myself, excellent feedback, detailed feedback on your assessments. We help you on your learning journey as the tutors, where we grade your assessments and give you feedback. That's just some information around how the course is actually run and how it and what you can expect. Alex, I think if there's no other questions in the Q&A, I think that's all we have time for today.
Great. I'll pull up the last slide, and then we'll say our goodbyes.
Fantastic.
So I'll share the screen again briefly. So just to reiterate, really, I can see that the next running of the MBA Fundamentals program is the 17th of June. We do have another one after that in September, but the next one that we're running is 17th of June. That's the code I was referring to earlier, the Summer 20 for the 20% discount. So that'll drop the price to 2,800. As I say, once you've paid that price, you're through and into the June cohort. The barcode on the left is for enrolling. The bar on the right is to book a call if you have any further questions with our success team here. If you have any interest in group bookings, we are very competitive with our corporate discounts as well. So it's not unusual for us to cascade this training through big organizations. It's typically those who are looking for an innovation, leadership, or cross-functional business thinking focus. We offer a lot of that on this course as we've covered. So I'll leave that there. I don't think there are any other questions, Attie. So I think we'll leave it with that one. But all that's left for me to say is thank you to the panel for joining. Thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you in June or indeed September.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I had fun, and I hope to see you on the program itself and working with you there. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you all. Thanks. Bye.